Good day to you, friends from the internet. I'm Daniel, and this is Driving and Dragons, the channel where I expound, comment, speak, advise, and wax philosophical about all things tabletop role-playing games. One thing I like to do here is point out all the things that you are doing to completely ruin your gaming experience, because as you would know from spending any amount of time on the internet, the one thing everyone agrees on is that the only objectively correct way to administer the rules and narrative of a TTRPG is the way employed by the person giving the advice. Every other way is to play the game wrong. Don't like it? Too bad. Them's the breaks. It's been a while since my last video in this objectively and factually superior GM advice series, so buckle up. It's time once again to find out how you're doing it wrong when it comes to critical misses in your TTRPG. It is my sworn duty as a YouTube content creator to inform you that the first and most important step to living a healthy life, finding financial success, and maximizing the fun at your table is to hit the like, hype, and subscribe buttons, sharing the video with your friends, and thanking me for showing you the light in the comment section. You can look it up. That's rules as written. You can also swear fealty on Patreon or YouTube memberships, or you can donate to the cause with super stickers as a sign of undying devotion to the only correct way to play make-believe games with dice and books. I've made you wait in the desert of bad gaming long enough now to drink deep from the wellspring of my greatness. So let's talk critical misses by first adding a caveat and of course defining our terms. There are many games such as Call of Cthulhu or Cyberpunk that have a fumble or critical failure mechanic built right into the system. In these games, I urge you to consider them long and hard before changing them. Just like any use of Rule 0 to alter a written rule, you must consider the consequences beyond the obvious beforehand. When these mechanics are part of the rules as written, it's safe to assume that the creators considered them when balancing the mechanics of the game against the feel and challenge of that game world. Removing or changing the critical failure mechanics could make a challenge more difficult than anticipated, or leave characters overpowered as a certain number of failures with harsh consequences are expected to occur in a given encounter. So if the game you are playing has critical misses as part of the core mechanics, not merely as a variant, you should think twice, then reconsider before making any changes. So what is a critical miss? Simply put, a critical miss is a mechanic whereby a failure that fits a set of negative criteria results in an outsized or additional negative effect beyond simple failure. A very easy to grasp classic example is on an attack roll, where instead of simply failing to damage the target, the failure is so bad that, say, a firearm jams, or a bowstring snaps, or a character stumbles, giving an enemy an advantage. What having critical failures adds to your game is an added element of danger, even in the most simple or mundane situations. It also adds a foil against increasingly powerful characters that helps teach them to respect the world around them, even when their chances of failure are minimal. As an added bonus, critical miss mechanics can also train players to more carefully consider alternatives and consequences before making a decision to act as a character, paying dividends in situations where no rolls are even being made. After all, if you've developed the muscle memory to think twice because of actions that are subject to the critical failure chance, that will instinctively carry over to situations where no rolls are necessary, leading to more decisions that reflect a real-life person in a real-life situation making a decision, as opposed to a player making a decision in a game, secure in the meta-knowledge that they know the floor that exists for negative consequences. So, how do we use critical misses? First, let's discuss what should determine a critical failure. There are three major ways to arrange the criteria for what a critical failure is. Fixed, scaled, and hybrid is what I'll call them. A fixed critical failure chance is pretty self-explanatory. There is a fixed number or range of results that always results in a fumble or chance to fumble. In a D20 system game, this would normally be a roll of a natural 1 on an attack, save, or check. In a percentile-based game, this may be a result of 95% or higher, or 5% or lower, depending on if it's a roll high or a roll low system. It may even fluctuate a bit, such as in Call of Cthulhu, where if a character is below a certain skill threshold, it's 95 and over, but once they reach that threshold, it's only on a roll of 000 that they fumble, thus representing that an expert level operator has not only less chance to fumble, but can often minimize the impact. I would, however, caution against increasing a fixed chance beyond 5%. Cyberpunk 2020 famously had a fixed critical failure chance on a D10, and that 10% chance made critical failures move from a boogeyman under the players' beds to a stalking monster that jammed guns and killed allies with disturbing frequency. If you want a little more realism and a bit more risk, I recommend moving to a scaled system. In a scaled system, critical failures are determined not by a specific result on a roll, but by a level of failure relative to the difficulty of the task. For instance, failing by 5 or 10. This makes it possible for an incredibly skilled character to make the lowest possible roll without risk, while a character has to truly consider an attempt that is at the edge of their limits. Using D&D as an example, if I'm an elite rogue facing a complex trap with a DC of 30, and my skill bonus to disarm is plus 25, I know that there is no way, there's no way I can trigger a critical failure. If miss by 5 or more is the standard, because 25 plus 1 is 26, I didn't fail by 5 or more. Since a player should not know the DC, the way this plays out is in the consideration of just how unlikely a failure by 5 or even more on a very difficult challenge would be. It also kind of plays into opposed rolls pretty well, because it's like, did the guards exceed my spot check by more than 5? Likewise, a mid-level rogue facing the same trap in the previous example with a plus 20 bonus knows that he has a pretty good chance at disarming even the most difficult traps. After all, even if the DC is 30, there's a 50-50 shot he succeeds. With no critical misses, this is a default. I'll go ahead and roll to disarm that trap. But if a critical failure is a failure by 5 or more, well, now he has a 50% chance to succeed, but a 25% chance that he blows the trap up in his face or has some other negative effect. Even without knowing the actual DC or the chances involved, this will factor into the calculus and forces players to think more critically and more realistically about their character's decisions. Just like the fixed method, I would stress moderation in the degree of failure required, particularly at low levels, where large failures are more likely. Having too great a range can dramatically increase the lethality of the game overall when, compound losses of equipment and resources lead to a spike in difficulty as more encounters occur. Lastly is the hybrid approach. This comes in two real flavors. The first makes the critical failure more likely, and the second makes it less likely. If you want added potential you have the same range as you would in the scaled approach, but you also have a fixed criteria that is always a fail. An example is fail by more than 5, but a natural 1 is always a critical failure. This obviously increases the risk by allowing for a fumble where mathematically one would be safe. The second is a hybrid method where you must trigger a set criteria and fail within a range. This would be something like, if you roll a natural 1, you critical fail if the result is 5 or more under a success. This reduces the number of fumbles by only bringing that scale into play if a fixed failure is triggered. The benefits beyond the obvious are that in the first method, where it's a critical miss is always there on a 1, or if you fail by more than 5, it ensures that there's never a situation where your skills are so complete that the danger disappears completely. While in that second hybrid method, lower skilled characters are not overly deterred from taking risks simply because they know that there is a high probability for failing outside the quote safe window on the scale. They have to fail by more than 5 or more than 10, and they have to roll the 1. The first favors higher level parties, while the second favors lower level parties in terms of adding to the game. What method you choose is something that should be determined by how you wish to adjust the system that you're using, as well as the overall atmosphere that you wish to promote in your game. By way of example, I would want to ratchet up the chances of extreme failure in a horror-themed game, especially if I'm using a system like D&D 3.5 or 5e. That makes horror much more difficult, as the heroic nature of the characters makes them very, very hard to threaten. Meanwhile, in a swashbuckling Princess Bride style adventure, I may want to par back my critical misses in such a way that promotes dashing theatrics and showmanship while retaining the chance of an embarrassing failure that creates a chaotic situation. So now that we know how to determine what causes a critical failure, let's talk consequences. Right off the bat, we know that there are going to most likely be different methods of handling a critical failure on a skill roll versus a combat roll. After all, while humorous, saying that a fumbled lockpick roll accidentally unlocked the fighter's belt buckle instead of the chest is not particularly realistic. Likewise, saying that you automatically fail your already missed attack roll doesn't feel particularly critical when you already missed. On skill rolls, there are 100 different ways to handle critical failures. Here are a few of my favorites. In D20 games, I'm fond of the -9 + 9 method. This one's pretty simple. If a natural 1 or 20 is rolled on a skill check, a D10 is rolled and treated as 0 through 9. On a natural 20, the roll is added. On a natural 1, the roll is subtracted. Nice and easy. It gives a benefit without automatic success on the 20. It gives a penalty but not automatic failure on the 1. Another option for failures is to add a complication. Even if the character can succeed with a 1, or if it's an opposed roll such as bluff or versus sense motive, a negative side effect can occur appropriate to the situation. For example, if a thief picks a lock and rolls a critical failure, regardless of whether or not he successfully picks the lock, maybe his lockpick slips, gouging a nasty scratch on the door. Now the thief has to choose between getting in and out quickly or taking the time to recover and cover up his mistake adequately so that it doesn't stand out to a guard or another observer who comes by. As a general rule, regardless of system, I dislike automatic failure and automatic success as a standard operating procedure. It leads to some unrealistic decision making by players when they know that they can always have a fixed chance to pull something off. It's the same reason I love critical failure rules. It makes even the most overpowered characters consider the consequences. There's another variant on the complication method that I'll cover in a bit, but it applies to both combat rolls and skill checks, so I'm going to put a pin in it for now. So what about combat? Nearly every game system has clearly defined rules for critical hits in combat, but many lack any kind of fumble rules or critical miss chances. For critical misses in combat, there are 3 categories of consequences that need to be considered: loss of resources, damage to allies, and worsening of the situation. Loss of resources includes things that cause either an immediate, permanent loss of effectiveness, or which require a decision between ability and time. An example of loss of effectiveness would be a squib load damaging a rifle receiver and taking that gun out of the fight permanently. An example of a loss that requires a decision would be an archer snapping a bowstring, requiring either abandoning the bow for a secondary weapon or taking the time needed to restring the bow. Damage to allies sounds pretty straightforward, but it is a bit more expansive than just you hit your buddy instead of your target. Damage to allies is anything that hinders another member of the party or yourself. The fighter charges into battle, and his fumble is that he trips while he's passing the wizard, knocking him off balance and requiring a concentration check to successfully cast a spell that round. The street punk unloads with his 9mm and has a near miss on the medic, blowing his med kit open and scattering the ruined supplies everywhere, meaning that now that medic has to either gather those supplies or take minuses on his heal checks. And yes, of course, the rogue's errant sneak attack slips between the bugbear's side and arm to neatly pierce the fighter in the shoulder. This is also where I would put things like the duelist overextends his lunge and provokes an attack of opportunity. Finally, you have worsening the situation. This is where there may be no immediate harm to the party, but where things definitely get worse. Perhaps an ill-fated auto-fire burst sinks a round into a high-pressure pipe, and now steam is covering the battlefield, and not only fog that makes it harder to hit your targets and see what's going on, but slippery, wet floors that make the footing more treacherous. Maybe the fighter's dwarven battle axe crashes into the magic mirror, and the demon spawn that were appearing one at a time from the mirror now flood in one from each broken piece. Perhaps that errant sword stroke cut a rope on a rope bridge that is now literally hanging on by a thread. Whatever it is, it gives the PC something else that they have to worry about. I mean, some of these can be adjusted further by adding saving throws or other ways to mitigate the situation. For example, when the fighter overextends his lunge, he can make a reflex save to avoid provoking that attack of opportunity. It also is very easy to add several universal combat situations onto a table for an easy D whatever roll to determine what happens. And that leads us back around to that important variant that we put a pin in earlier. This obviously doesn't apply if you have a table worked up or if you've decided to go with a more static method such as the add or subtract D10 method. But this is a valuable tool for any of these situational complications. One thing you don't want to do as a GM is be seen as favoring one player over another, protecting the players from consequences, or deliberately trying to force them into failure. When the fighter rolls a critical failure and runs the rogue through, then the cleric critical fails and fumbles his mace, losing an attack. You can see all 3 of these in action. First, the fighter wants to know why he killed an ally while the cleric just had to lose his second attack. Then the rogue wants to know why you set the entire party up for failure by having the fighter hit the squishiest PC on the battlefield. And next you have everyone thinking that they're getting a bit of a handout and some little hand holding there because after that nasty failure you lobbed in a softball with the old, he just kind of fumbled his mace a little bit and gets a save. Of course, no one thinks that you have good motivations for these decisions. You're clearly either persecuting them or condescending to them because, well, they're players and that's what players do. What's a good way to handle that? My personal favorite, critical miss mechanic, the severity die. What is that? Well, be it skill or combat roll, when I have a player crit fail, I roll on the severity die. Doesn't matter if it's scaled, hybrid, or fixed, I roll a die. Personally, I like the D30, but any die will do. Just be conscious of the fact that each level of severity represents a much bigger step up in awful the smaller the die you use. Obviously, if you use a D10, it's a 10% increase each time it goes up. Whereas if you use a D100, it's only a 1%. When that D30 comes up low, say 1 to 10, the failure is more or less a minor inconvenience. You thumb the mag release, and your nearly full magazine falls out of your pistol. You can scoop it up or just slam in a fresh one for the low cost of a move action. If the severity roll is low enough, like a 1, 2, 3, something like that, you may even get a dex check or a reflex save to do something cool like kick the magazine up into the air while it's falling and catch it with your free hand, mitigating the need for that move action. If it falls somewhere in the middle, like 11 to 20, I typically roll out either or scenarios or give a serious complication that has a pretty good save chance or a way to correct it. Like the example with the lockpick above, heavily scratching that door, or a failed sneak knocking a vase off of a table, but allowing a save to catch it before it loudly smashes into the tile floor. Both of those have some serious issues there, but the heavily scratched door gives you the either you sacrifice the speed to cover up the scratches or you risk getting caught to get in and out fast. And the vase, you screwed up and you're kind of loud, but you get a save to be, to not alert everybody by busting the vase. When it rolls high, 21 to 30, this is where the really bad stuff happens, or where the frustrating things that happen with no save. The rifle that breached the receiver and became completely useless, that's going to be in that high range. You've destroyed a piece of equipment. That's a weapon that's no longer functional. Your auto fire lighting up the party netrunner, cutting the rope bridge so that everyone is rolling a save to avoid their doing their best Gandalf at Khazad-dûm impersonation. These all kind of fall into that bad category. Now you may be asking yourself, what is the benefit to these critical misses? I feel like I outlined them pretty well, but here are a few to chew on. They force players to consider their actions in ways beyond simple mechanics. They add realism to those decisions by mitigating the idea of the worst that can happen is it doesn't work. They add excitement to otherwise mundane situations. Want an example of that? How about two frost giants square up to a 9th level party? It's a dangerous encounter, sure, but the PCs are fully healed up and prepared in advance for a fight. It's not going to be too difficult. Well, it wasn't. At least until the monk rolled a critical failure and punted the paladin squarely in the testicles, leaving him crumpled in the snow and shifting a manageable fight into a desperate struggle for survival. The entire party survived, but later when a challenge rating 7 creature came up on him in open ground, what should have been a cakewalk turned into a near TPK, with the monk dying and the wizard barely surviving to teleport away with the paladin, who lost 2 major pieces of equipment to the creature. All because of a critical failure putting a little extra spice onto the dish. Are critical failures necessary to have a fun game? No, they're not. But they sure as hell make it easier to. And honestly, if you aren't using them because you somehow feel it intrudes on player agency or it's unfair, then you're doing it wrong. See you guys next time.